When items are nerfed, how large is the scope of champs that Riot looks at being affected? And you're giving an example of when Kraken got nerfed, Kindred got nerfed. So this is something that happens a lot, is that people will say, hey, my character builds this thing, and you nerfed it, so now my character sucks and you need to buff it, right? Sometimes that's true. But usually it's mainly true when a character is like tied to an item in a way that they have no substitutes. So as an example, if we ever nerf Nashor's Tooth, Kale's in trouble, at least her AP build is, because her entire pattern is based on Nashor's Tooth as a thing, right? The thing with most item nerfs, though, is that when we nerf an item, it will nerf other people who use the item, which matters. And then often, because items are part of a system where you can swap items and buy other things, it often means that if an item is nerfed, many champions will just build something else. So, as an example, years ago we removed Gunblade, and I buffed Akali because I thought she'd need it, because, well, clearly she needed Gunblade, and it's gone, so she's going to be so bad. But that ended up being a mistake, because it turns out that Akali could just turn around and spend the 3,000 gold she had spent on Gunblade on a bunch of other powerful items that were also strong on her. And so, at the end of the day, by preemptively buffing Akali when we removed Gunblade, I ended up creating an overpowered character, and we had to remove those buffs. And so it's kind of idea that, like, did Kraken Slayer get weaker for ranged? Yes. Could that have affected Kindred? Yes. I'm not saying it did or didn't. I don't know the answer to that. I haven't checked. But I am saying that oftentimes we will follow up on characters if that happens, where it's like, oh, wow, this character got really bad after these item changes. Let's, help them out. Because a lot of times what we see is when a character's items get nerfed, they just build another item. And so it's a thing where the question I would ask is, okay, Kindred build Kraken Slayer. Are there other items she could build instead of Kraken Slayer that make her, similarly powerful? Maybe the answer is no, right? Maybe it just got nerfed and she's nerfed and she needs buffs, right? I, again, don't know the answer to that, but kind of given the idea that the item system is often interchangeable and often affects large numbers of champions at the same time. And so we often do not do preemptive buffs or nerfs for champions with the item system changes, unless we're like very confident that they're going to need it. And we'll often like see how it pans out. And oftentimes, a lot of things that look like they're going to be really bad for a character just mean that character potentially is buying another item. Why does Riot hate assassins when they're not in pro? Why do you balance them around low elo? So I just actually made a TikTok about this, but I'll start with just, I don't think we necessarily hate assassins, although I think you're very reasonable to feel like assassins perhaps have been having some sad times recently. The ideal League of Legends balance state is not everything is perfectly tuned around pro. It is highly valuable and important to have a vibrant pro game with lots of different viable picks, but that does not necessarily mean that every character should be balanced there or every class. Like, as an example, we kind of have removed enchanters from pro over the last couple years post durability patch because we were like, oh wait, pro ends up being a lot worse when enchanters are there, but they're still viable in most games. So just noting that, like, it's not a goal that every character is balanced in high MMR or perfectly balanced or perfectly viable there. It's nice, but that's not always the best outcome. I was just making a TikTok about how basically one of the things you always have to consider when making a game is the idea that perception influences reality. It's just important. Well, it can be important to have objective balance in your game. It's also really important to have subjective balance based on player perception. And so one of the things we care a lot about is, does the game feel enjoyable for all the groups of players who play it? And we separate that into basically 4 basic groups of players. We have pro players, we have elite players, which are like, Diamond 1 plus. We have high MMR players, which is Emerald plus, top 10%. And we have everybody else. And we generally think that the game is like fairly important that all those groups of players feel like the game is balanced for them to some degree and is enjoyable to play. And so if you have a character who sucks in high MMR, but completely obliterates 90% of your player base, that character is probably too strong and probably needs to be nerfed, regardless of how good it is for challenger players. Because it is important that your 90% of players who are losing to it have a good time and feel like it's fair and balanced. And so we tend to make sure that no characters are overpowered in any given bracket of our players. And you might ask, well, like, what's the point of that? Like, just tell them to get good, right? Like that's usually like the response to that is, well, hey, if these silver players can't handle playing against Briar, just tell them to get good. Like it's a competitive game, right? And it's important that the average player enjoys your game, because the average player provides the player base for the good players to come from, and the pro players to come from, and the fans to come from, and all that stuff. And so when you have a game that's only fun for your challenger players, the bottom of that game falls out, and then there won't be any challenger players anymore because the game will be dead. And so it's very, very important that you've made a game that's enjoyable for everyone who plays it, not just the top of the ladder. It is very important that the top of the ladder is enjoyable. I want to be very clear. I am not saying ignore challenger players. I'm not saying ignore pro players. But I'm saying you have to consider everyone. Very important. I feel like StarCraft 2 was a game that kind of like screwed up, honestly, in regards to casual players. If you were a casual player in StarCraft 1, that game in a lot of ways felt more playable, and even if you couldn't play StarCraft 1, you had a lot of things like use map settings. And then when Blizzard made StarCraft 2, slip of the tongue, StarCraft 2, they removed a lot of the like casual stuff you could do, like the use map settings and the modded maps and stuff like that. And then the base game itself was just really, really stressful and really, really hard. And it was a great game. It was a fun game, but it was very hard to be like a casual player of that game. And I think that ended up making that game's community over time suffer to some degree, would be my take on it. So I think it's something you have to worry about. Someone says, Emerald is high MMR in what world? So we have two bands of high MMR. We have Elite and we have High. And the way we think about it is as follows. Average players are 90% of the player base. And we lump Iron players in with Gold players in this case. Like we don't balance specifically for Iron, we balance for the average between Iron, Silver, Gold, Bronze, etc. All that stuff. That's 90% of the player base. And one of the things we think about with the average players is they're probably not playing the game all that optimally. It turns out that most characters are viable in low MMR if you just one-trick them and are actually trying to get good at the game, right? Then we have Elite, high MMR. High MMR we consider Emerald Plus. It's about the top 10% of players. And the reason we call that high MMR, which is different from what you call high MMR, is that's where we think the game starts being optimized. And that's where the game then starts changing. Because once you optimize the game and you learn how to last hit and to macro and to lane and to play as a team and all these other things, the game starts changing, and suddenly Master Yi isn't strong anymore because people are suddenly starting to group and stun him, and suddenly certain assassins aren't as strong anymore because the enemy team will group up and deal with them. And so strategies that can really stomp a low MMR lobby start to fail around the top 10% of the player base. And then finally, the last group of players that we consider is Elite MMR. And Elite MMR is like Diamond 1 plus. It's like the top 2%, 1.5%. I think it's like top 1 to 1.5% of the player base, which, by the way, there's still higher to go than that. Like, there's a massive difference between a Challenger player and a Diamond player. But we consider that because they're like the best of the best, where the game is like hyper optimized. And that's going to be a whole different set of things as well. Like, as an example, Draven is a lot more of a problem when you're a Challenger level player. Talon Jungle is a lot more of a problem when you're a Challenger level player compared to what players might experience against those champions in Silver or Gold, because in Challenger, those players know how to abuse a laning phase on Draven. They know how to abuse the map mobility on Talon Jungle when it was decent, right? So that's a whole nother state of the game that we think is important to balance around. And so, yeah, kind of mentioning there's different groups of players which represent different degrees of like optimization of the game and competitiveness of the game, and we tend to consider them all.